Again, those comments from the Minister. The new Auckland Council, with $28 billion worth of assets, and I think a debt profile of around $3 billion, possibly a little more perhaps, is obviously going to have needs far and away in excess of any other local council, and it makes sense that this bill has the sort of flexibility structured in that will allow the Auckland Council to go offshore in its own right to borrow the funds that it needs. I'd be interested to know, and I don't know whether the Minister would know this, but I'd be interested to know what share of the borrowing by the local government funding agency is expected to end up with the Auckland Council. So presumably the Auckland Council will be borrowing some funds from the agency, but also going offshore in its own right. And I'd be interested to know what the proportions are likely to be. As Brendan Burns was suggesting, Auckland's going to have some significant capital investment needed in the coming decade or so if it's going to reach the sort of aspirations that the country has for it and that Aucklanders have for it. The city rail link, which has been something of that's been hotly debated in this House in recent times, is going to cost between $1.5 and $2 billion, and there's a whole debate about how that's funded. And I think that mum and dad investors in Auckland would probably see that as something that would be well worth supporting and investing in. And there's a number of other mechanisms that the councils has the ability to raise money in various ways, but borrowing through the funding agency would be a pretty desirable way to contribute to the cost of that. It's a shame that Stephen Joyce doesn't see the City Rail Link as something that's worth investing in for Auckland's future, because I'm sure most Aucklanders would see it as something that was well worth investing in. So I think it makes sense that the Auckland Council's got the ability to go offshore in its own right, and we heard at the Select Committee that because of the size of its borrowing requirements and the undesirability of the funding agency lending so disproportionately to one council, that it makes sense for Auckland to be able to borrow offshore. And they told us that, really reassured us, I suppose, that the borrowing would be undertaken on a fully hedged basis, and that they have the capacity through their Treasury unit to minimise the risk to the Auckland ratepayer. So we, on this side of the House, we're very comfortable with the provisions in Part 2, Mr Chairman, and if the Minister is able to tell us anything about the likely share of Auckland Council's lending. No? All right.
Stuart Nash. Mr Twyford and the Minister has actually outlined some of the points I had, but there are a couple of other points I would like to make. And I agree that Auckland is now so large that it needs to own its own future. It has to have the ability to fund, to go offshore, because the depth of our capital markets just isn't big enough for it. I understand that. And I suppose the Auckland City Treasury will have to determine itself how much money it wants to put into the rating agency versus how much it wants to borrow on the back of its own council. It'd be interesting to know how much it would do that, because again, as the Minister alluded to, I suppose the funding agency will be reasonably dependent upon the level of funding that the Auckland City Council can put into that, and therefore the scale or the rating and etc. that the funding agency will have in itself. I suppose there are 2 points that I would like to make, Mr Chair, and they're not really questions, but they're reasonably significant points in my mind. The first one is the report to shareholders and stakeholders. The Auckland City Council is responsible to well over 1 million people who pay the rates, who will service this debt. Now, I think it is up to the Auckland City Council to make absolutely sure that the ratepayers and the stakeholders know exactly what the Auckland City Council is and what its policy is. Mr Twyford mentioned that the Auckland City Treasury has said that it will undertake a fully hedged strategy, and I agree with that. But let me give you a couple of examples, because I think that currency risk is now huge, and this adds another risk on top of all the other risks that councils have got to manage. I know, for example, the Minister himself might remember when the New Zealand dollar was around about 70 cents to the US at one stage. This was late last century. It plummeted. It went from about 65 down to about 50 in about 6 months. And the Carter Holt Harvey Treasury at the time, Carter Holt Harvey I think was New Zealand's second or third largest company at the time, its treasury had a hedging strategy, but it also played the currency market to a certain extent, and it lost literally millions and millions of dollars trying to bet on the New Zealand currency that it had no idea about. And there are jokes around how to play the currency market. One is that you ask 10 economists and you go with what the minority says. No, the bottom line is, I suppose, what I'm trying to say is no one knows how to play the currency markets and wins. It's a little bit like putting it on black in the casino. You're going to win sometimes, you're not going to win other times. And this is a risk that I think that I would really like to know, and I don't think the Minister can tell me because it is an operational manager, but the Auckland City Council must tell its ratepayers how it is going to manage. I remember I went to a seminar once, Mr. Chair, and this was conducted by Deutsche Bank, who at the time were they still are, one of the largest banks in the world, and this was for small to medium business owners. And the advice from the head of Deutsche Bank at the time was, he said, in terms of overseas trading, if you're in US dollars, I would hedge 50% and then I'd play the currency market the other 50%. And I was astounded that a banker could give this advice to business people who relied on the margin of the deal being done. He was basically advising these people to play the currency market. And that sort of advice was, astounded me that he could give this. And this is why we have to be very careful, and we have to have a very good understanding of the strategy that the Auckland City Council is going to take in terms of borrowing in foreign funds. Because I have no doubt, at some stage, a smart banker will stand up at council and say, if it didn't hedge at 83, as the dollar goes down to 70, you would have made a whole lot of money. And we are all very wise in hindsight when it comes to currency trading. Believe me, we are very wise in hindsight. But at the time, if the strategy isn't on the table and if it isn't followed very, very strictly, then I'll tell you what, there will be accusations and there will be court cases of mismanagement. Of that I have no doubt whatsoever. Again, let me give you two examples. I used to deal with two examples of large New Zealand companies that imported. One hedged the whole time. The other one didn't, because it took advice from, I won't name the name of the bank, but one of New Zealand's largest banks. This is when the dollar was at around 50. He said, don't hedge, don't worry, it's going to be up about 55 by Christmas. By Christmas, it was down to 45, and that company had lost about $2 million just playing the currency market. I suppose my point is that you can take, not you, Mr. Chair, the council and anyone can take advice from a whole range of people who say they know how to play the currency market, about what it's about and the best strategy to make money with this. But no one knows. No one gets it right 100% of the time. So what needs to happen is the council has to have a very strict policy on this, and it must adhere to it.
Question is that the question be now put. Those of that opinion will say aye. Chair. Contrary, no. Ayes have it. Party vote. The clerk will conduct a party vote.
New Zealand National?
57 votes in favour.
New Zealand Labour?
42 votes opposed.
Green Party?
7 votes opposed.
ACT New Zealand?
4 votes in favour.
Māori Party?
3 votes in favour.
Progressive?
1 vote opposed.
United Future?
1 vote in favour.
Mana? Honourable Chris Carter? Any other votes?
The ayes are 65, the noes are 50. The questions will be put. And the question is that part 2 stand part. Those of that opinion will say aye. Contrary no. The ayes have it. The question now is that clauses 1 and 2 stand part.
Chair.
Phil Twyford.